I'd like to talk about the LLM side of things as well. Now, because you mentioned that you're probably going to want to pick like a decent, like whatever the best sort of LLM available is when you start creating a chatbot, but then you might swap it out for something cheaper to run. Can you think of, when you're building an application, can you think of the LLM and the vector database separately, or is there some kind of relationship between them that you need to worry about?
So first of all, depending on the task at hand, you might be able to use cheaper, maybe less powerful LLMs. So that's already something that one should be aware of. So you don't need GPT-4 for everything. You don't need the most powerful LLM for everything. It's really task dependent. But in some sense, the quality of your vector database and how scalable your vector database is also has something to say here. So one thing we have found, and we've written about it and so on, is you could take GPT-3, GPT 3.5. You could take all the data that it was trained on, just put that data into a vector database, and use GPT 3.5 along with that vector database. And you have better groundedness and better ultimate retrieval capability than GPT-4. Okay, which means that as a weaker model with a powerful vector database, even just retrieving on data that the model was already trained on, can still do at least as good, if not better, than the state-of-the-art models. Okay, and we have found this to be true even for some open source models as well. So clearly, this means that if you use vector databases together with LLMs, you actually can, the sum of parts is actually bigger, right? In some sense, you can get more bang for the buck by doing that. But even otherwise, it's important for you to know that you don't always need the best LLM for every task. Now, in terms of cost, today the cost is dominated by large language models. Okay, so language models really dominate this cost. And in fact, the bigger language models provide you bigger context, and that's actually expensive as well. But sometimes bigger context actually helps. So even understanding exactly what some workflow should cost you is pretty tricky today. So you might go with a bigger context with a bigger language model and end up with a cheaper workflow. Sometimes you can go with a smaller model with lesser context, with more data in a vector database, and end up with a cheaper workflow. But overall, I think what I can say safely is that the more you use vector databases in the loop and more do you kind of leverage it, the cheaper it's going to turn out to be. And in fact, there's a lot of research that shows that you could even take a lot of what the language models already know and put them into the vector database, and that's going to lead to a overall more economical workflow. So I think economics is going to drive us in that direction anyway.
Okay, that's very interesting that just if you make more use of vector databases, then you can go with a cheaper language model and the overall cost of creating a chatbot might be less. I'm curious as to when you need like the best sort of LLM and when a lesser LLM or a low-powered sort of a cheaper one will do. Do you have a sense of which tasks you need for which?
Yeah, I think it's mainly reasoning tasks. And so the best LLMs are really good at reasoning and really good at picking out, in some sense, paying attention to the, even if you give an LLM a large context, it's not necessarily going to be good at picking out the things that matter from the things that don't matter. Okay, this is usually the hard problem with giving LLMs the whole context. Okay, but we find that some of the powerful LLMs distinguish themselves in that ability. Okay, and they distinguish themselves in the general reasoning ability. That's also because they've been trained on a lot of data. Okay? But again, this is evolving as we speak. As we speak, there are newer models coming out, particularly open source models that are increasingly challenging language models, the proprietary language models, and so on. So whatever I say here is going to be obsolete in 3 months. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, actually, just on that note, it just seemed like the best LLM just changes weekly. And I guess you need to build your applications to make sure that it's possible to swap out the LLM in order to optimize it. Is there anything you need to do in order to ensure that that's possible?
Yeah, so I think the more you can treat your LLM as, in some sense, a black box that you can actually optimize away, the better, because that landscape is changing quite a bit. Of course, you really need to understand prompt engineering, because the prompt engineering is specific to LLMs and so on, and so you want to be careful about that. But if you can engineer your abstractions in such a way that you can swap out an LLM, that's I think eventually a good thing to do. That said, while we see that the leaderboard is changing quite often, and like there is a lot of competition in some sense at the top for language models, one thing to keep in mind is that there is not a lot of private data. There's not a lot of really good metrics and really good data that the LLMs themselves have not seen. So in some sense, the best indicator of an LLM's performance for your application is actually your data and your queries and trying it out, because I can tell you from a lot of benchmarks that we do and a lot of data that we have collected and so on, there is still a gap between open source models and proprietary models and so on, even though that gap is getting closed as we speak. Because in this entire space, we are still missing really good metrics. We're still missing really good data sets that, in some sense, the models have no idea about. And the ability to generalize that sort of data and those sort of queries and so on is what matters for people at the end of the day.